I'm going to tie a rubber leg copper john, and I've got one of these videos up already, and I tied it with a straight shank nymph hook and used rubber legs for the legs and the tail. But lately I've been tying them with a regular goose biot tail and on a scud hook, and really like the look of them, and they've been fishing well, so I thought I'd tie one up for you today. So as mentioned, I've got a scud hook in the vise. This is a size 10. I've got an 1/8 inch gold tungsten bead, and the thread that I'm going to use is a 70 black, and I like this because it lays nice and flat. I'm going to start behind the lead, and I'll take some wraps up through to lock it in and bring it down, remove that tag, and I'll take it down to beyond the bend. And for these biots I like to put a little bump in there, and that'll help keep the biots apart. So I'm going to take my brown goose biots, I'll take off 2, and I'll put these back to back so it creates that natural V, and then the thread ball will just assist it. And then I'll measure it out, and I'll put a biot on either side, and I'll lean it slightly towards me. It'll make some twists as you turn it here, so you just want to make sure that you've compensated for that. At this point, with one wrap on, you can make any adjustments that you need to, and when I'm happy with it, I'm going to hold it with my fingers, and then I'll wrap these ends in, and then I can come back through and trim. And I'll tie these off behind the lead. And now I can take my copper wire, and this is a brassy size, and I like to spool it. It gives me a little bit more control and a little bit less waste. And I'll set this behind the lead and on the side facing me, and I'll take some turns, and then I'll spend a little bit of time to make sure that I'm following the contour of the wire, or I'm sorry, of the hook shank. And anytime you have a wire wrapped body, the more time you spend smoothing everything out underneath, the better your body's going to look. So spend just a little extra time on that, especially at this transition point where it goes to your from the hook to the lead. Now normally what I would do is I'd put this thread in a cradle and I'd use the rotary function, but with the camera in the vise position it's a little bit tougher. So I'm just going to spool this close, and I'll start by wrapping, nice side-by-side wraps all the way up, and this is where it really pays off to have a smooth underbody, because it'll keep those wire wraps nice and tied up. So at this point I can reattach my thread, and again, if you're going to use the rotary function, you just advance it back up, and I'll hold my wire at the top position, and I'll back my thread to it, and then take a couple of turns of my thread, and I'll keep good tension on it, and I can just helicopter that off, and it'll leave me with a nice clean break. I'm going to adjust my position slightly. The flash for this is going to be a pearl tinsel, so I'll take a section of it off, And I'll tie this on top. Again, you want to make sure it's nice and centered. And then I'll take some thin skin, and you can use a mottled oak thin skin. I'm going to use just a plain black, and I've cut it into a strip that might be a 1/4 inch or so. And I've cut one tip into a V shape so that I can catch it. And again, you want to make sure that this is nice and centered. And you also want to make sure that you take it back far enough, and maybe even overlap a turn of that copper wire to make sure that when you pull it over, it doesn't expose the thread underneath. So happy with that, then I'm going to tie in some peacock herl for the thorax, and I'll take 2 strands and I'll trim these tips and tie these into the side. And again, make sure you tie them back far enough. I'm going to leave my thread then at the midway point between the back of the bead and where the copper wire ends, so that I can tie in my legs. And for this, you've got a lot of choices if you have a preference to a type of rubber leg you want to use. I'm going to go with an extra small brown rubber leg, and I do that because I like the movement that it has to it. And I'll double that over and situate it. I'll take a rough cut here, and I'll do the same thing to the other side. So double it over and position it. Take a wrap through. I'm just going to give these a rough trim to length here. Make sure they're tied in good, and then I'll advance my thread to behind the bead. Now I can work my peacock herl through, and you just have to navigate around the legs, or you can tie them back if you want, but it's not too bad to work through. So a couple of wraps behind the legs, maybe a wrap or 2 in front, depending on how bulky it is, and that looks pretty good. So now I'm going to go in front of these legs, and again another 2 or 3 wraps, and finish behind the bead. Now I can bring my thread up through, and once you have one wrap in, it'll keep that as long as you keep good tension on it. I'll take a couple of wraps behind, and then I can trim that. And when I have those cut ends, I like to take maybe 1 or 2 more just to make sure that they really cinch down nice. You're not going to be able to see that thread through the herl. You can make any adjustments that you want with your legs. They're not going anywhere. And then I'll pull my thin skin up and over, and I'll take a wrap or 2 on top, and again 1 or 2 underneath. And at this point, I'm going to cut my thin skin, and then I'll pull the tinsel over, making sure that it's again nice and centered. And I'll put a wrap, maybe 2 in, and then I'll fold this back over and do the same thing. That way when you cut the end and you put your epoxy or whatever you're going to use on top, it's going to show as just a flap that goes back, and you won't see it, as opposed to hanging out over the front. So go ahead and cut that tinsel off, and now I can whip finish. And again, you just need to navigate around the legs when you do this. You don't need to put in too many turns. I'm going to use a epoxy or some sort of resin to coat the back of it, and then I'll go ahead and trim. I'll pull up the legs and cut to kind of a final size, and I've been leaving these a little bit longer. I really like the movement that it has. So now that everything's in place, the last step is to take your favorite epoxy or clear cure glue, or whatever you're going to use. I'm going to use a Loctite product. It probably takes a little bit longer than I'd like to dry, but I really like the finished product. It almost leaves it a little like rubbery on top, and it has just the right amount of set. So I'll apply epoxy, or again, whatever you're going to use, and then I'll smooth that out so that it goes back onto the wire and covers the thread and all of that thin skin. So that's another Copper John. Again, I've tied it on these curved, on these scud hooks, and really like the look of them, and they've been fishing well. So that is a rubber leg Copper John the second.